We'll start off with introductions, but first, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy day for you all in the middle of the week. We're really excited to start talking about end of year, both excited and terrified, I should say, because it is just June. But we know that offline partners start talking about, what they're going to do in direct mail and other channels pretty soon. And so we wanted to make sure that we were thinking through what we should be talking about as digital folks. And then at the same time, it sort of just happened that Apple decided to make a rather large announcement that they're going to roll out in September, which obviously is just before end of year. So we thought we would marry the two and bring everybody together to have a conversation about all of them. So before we jump into the deck, I will introduce myself. For those of you who do not know, I'm Maureen McNally, an Executive Vice President here at Ann Lewis Strategies, really helping to oversee a lot of the nonprofit practice and ensure that we're creating both solutions and products that align with the needs of our nonprofits. And so with that, I can pass it off to one of my colleagues, Alex Stein.
Hey all, thanks so much for joining. My name is Alex Stein. I'm a vice president here at Ann Lewis. I spend a lot of my time thinking about how nonprofits and advocacy organizations, can kind of maximize their impact around big moments like end of year. And so I wanted to join this conversation to help answer any questions in that regard. Orwin, I can pass it to you if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I would love to. Hi, folks. I think I've interacted with many of you before, but my name is Orwin Evenson. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Brooklyn. I'm a vice president here at Ann Lewis Strategies, and I work very closely with Maureen and Alex to oversee our nonprofit practice. I'll be doing a fair amount of the talking today, but before we hop into all of that, let's have Duncan introduce herself.
Thanks, Orwin. Hi, I'm Duncan Stewart. I'm a senior digital strategist here at Ann Lewis, and I work on the strategy and execution, including a whole lot of end-of-year planning for email, SMS, and mid-level programs across our nonprofit clients, including Save the Children and Sandy Hook Promise. And with that, I will pass back to Orwin to kick us off.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get interactive from the jump here. I know Duncan and I are quite capable of talking for an hour straight, but I think that these are always much more fun if they're a little bit conversational, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions that are going to come up. So feel free to interrupt us with those questions as we go. But first up, I sort of imagine that there are two types of responses to folks that folks might have had when Maureen mentioned the Apple update. Some of you were like, yes, please tell me all of the things about this. And maybe some of you were like, wait, what is Apple doing now, right? So a quick show of hands or come off mute and let us know real quickly if you have heard about this Apple update over the past week or so. I'm assuming most of you have, but maybe not everyone. Great, I see some hands raised here. Awesome. Great, so lots of you. For the rest of you, we'll get to all the end of year planning stuff soon, but let's talk about this Apple update. On the screen in front of you is verbatim what their policy update has done. In short, as part of their sort of consumer privacy protection initiative that Apple has been doing, they've announced that in their next OS update this fall, they're going to stop allowing the use of pixels to collect information about their users in email. This is especially relevant to us as email marketers because virtually all email service providers rely on these invisible pixels, which are downloaded when a user opens an email, right, to determine whether that user has actually opened an email. So functionally, what that means is that Apple will sort of use this policy to essentially scan and trigger all of those pixels the moment those emails hit the inboxes. So users that use Apple Mail on desktop or mobile, which is a ton, it's like 40% of the market share on mobile, will basically have 100% open rate. And that's going to mean that open rates are going to be really, really inflated and in many cases not very usable in the ways that we might hope to use them or have traditionally used them. So this change is going to impact a lot of metrics that we regularly use. And on this next slide, here are a few of the things that we think are going to be affected. Most obviously, as we sort of just said, open rate, which already as a metric is a bit fuzzy to begin with. That's going to be like much less usable. We're especially bummed about not really being able to reliably use GIFs over opens, which is one of our favorite measures of effectiveness of our content. But because those open rates are going to be so high, it's not actually going to be a good read anymore. Those opens are also going to make it pretty impossible to measure engagement for list hygiene purposes. So for those of you who rely on engagement metrics, both opens and clicks to determine whether someone is engaging with your content and to determine whether someone is inactive or something like that, that's going to be much more difficult to use, and those opens aren't going to mean what we typically expect them to mean anymore. There are a couple other edge cases that are going to be affected by this. I don't know that a ton of nonprofits use pixel tracking within their email for their advertising efforts, but some folks can do that or do that, and those won't really work at a pixel level. So you'd have to rely on link tracking with whatever DMP you might be using. If you are using a service for dynamic image generation based on geographic location, there are a ton of services out there that might do that. You can have dynamic countdown clocks. You can like determine the weather in a user's behavior or in a user's specific location. Those won't really work. And any of those A/B tests that you might run based on open rates are all going to be pretty affected. So we're not thrilled by all of this news that Apple has unleashed on us. But ultimately, we also don't think that it's the end of the world. I think it's going to focus our attention on the metrics that are even more important. So in a very macro sense, like in the strategic sense of everything, I don't think that this change is going to dramatically affect any of our plans. We're not going to overhaul anything that we're planning to do for end of year or elsewhere based on content or anything like that. However, we're definitely going to need to focus on some higher order metrics that I mentioned in engagements, more like clicks and donations instead of those options. So I think even on the next slide, we have this outlined a little bit here. And we typically pay more attention to clicks and opens, or clicks and donations rather, instead of opens. And we're going to continue to do a lot more of that in the future. We're also going to need to like figure out a better way of monitoring and tracking email deliverability by domains, because we won't be able to rely on open rates. And a lot of the conversations that we've been following have sort of used the analogy of like a car engine light that goes off in your car. As like, that's really what open rate is sort of doing for a lot of things. It is this trigger or this flag. It's a way that we can determine the health of certain things, but in and of itself isn't the health, right? It's not the actual engine. We'll still be able to check on click rates and donation rates and response rates and a bunch of other metrics to optimize our programs. We just won't necessarily have that reliable or semi-reliable flag that tells us if something is going super wrong. So I think, perhaps more importantly, or most importantly for all of you, I think is the need with this change to have a conversation with your senior management about these changes. There are going to be tons of folks, especially the non-marketing folks out there, that are going to be asking about open rates because it's one of the most visible and easily understood metrics when it comes to email marketing. And so we'll just need to educate those people on what metrics are more important and the most important moving forward. And we're just going to need to do a lot of that education, which we've been trying to do with a lot of with our partners over the years, and I'm sure you all have been doing with your senior folks too. And to that end, our data science team is very much monitoring and looking into all of this too. So as we start to see these trends across clients, as we start to see things crop up here and there, and as we start exploring more in different solutions, we'll definitely share with you all in future webinars what we're finding. We're very actively and closely monitoring all of this. But in the meantime, if you guys have any further questions about Apple's policies, any of this and how it might affect your program, we are more than happy to field some of those questions now, or you can always follow up with us on email for some more specific answers or some one-on-one conversations about how this might affect your program in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop rambling. And if any of you have questions, feel free to toss it in the chat or just come off mute and ask away. No questions. I'm glad we answered everything proactively for you. That's awesome. If you have anything else though, come holler at us on email. Sorry, go ahead, Duncan.
No, thanks, Erwin. Great. So, why are we talking about end of year planning in June? The simple answer is that, it's really never too early to start end of year planning. We like to say that the next end of year begins on January 2nd. And you can see here, we like to say always be planning. The longer answer is that, your direct mail teams are probably going to begin planning their end of year content in July. This is a really essential time to bring all of your teams together to determine your end of year messaging and branding for your entire organization. You want to be using direct mail's planning schedule, but letting digital drive your concepts and creative. So you want to make sure that you have your digital team in those direct mail brainstorms. Once you're in those brainstorms, you want to think about what is the digital team's priorities. A few things, you can't be filling out the digital calendar so far in advance as direct mail can. Their schedules are obviously a little bit different, but there are some big picture strategic decisions that you need to make in this brainstorm at that moment to set you up for a really successful end of year. First, you should be thinking about what concepts are going to work for both channels and are there any that won't. Digital and direct mail should be working together for an integrated approach, but shouldn't be exactly the same. They are different channels, should be closer to siblings than twins. Next, you want to be thinking about, how can digital be included in your direct mail campaigns? One thing that we've been thinking about is I think all of us are a lot more accustomed to using QR codes now after several months of using them, to order at restaurants. Can the direct mail team be adding those to end of year packages to make going online and making a gift that much easier? And then, of course, we always want to be sharing key learnings across teams. What are some best practices and new learnings that the digital team can be sharing with the direct mail team from last end of year, from the first 6 months of 2020? And then, of course, vice versa, thinking about what will work across channels. Another thing to be thinking about is, are there strategies and tactics that might take a little bit more time in planning, things like premiums or merchandise that are going to be used for direct mail? The digital can also benefit from things that, you can put in place right now so that by the time we get to end of year, you're totally ready to go. And then, of course, want to be thinking about, a surround sound feel for your direct mail supporters. Can you be targeting them via email, via Facebook to both remind them of their direct mail packages and just to give them another avenue to donate to? So I would say that, the most important takeaway to come away from this webinar with is make sure that your digital team is in the room for direct mail planning. You want to make sure that these questions are getting answered and that your organization has one really surround sound feel, one strategy going into end of year to make sure that every channel is complementing each other and to make sure that digital is on a really, really great foot going into end of year. But of course, go ahead, Aaron.
Sorry, to that point, Duncan, I just want to, we're focusing a lot on direct mail because direct mail and digital tend to be the two largest channels, but the same lessons can be applied to whatever other channels that you have that are really big and important during end of year as well. If you have a really massive telemarketing program, or if you have a big face-to-face program or anything else, you can use similar questions and things. You just want to make sure that you have digital representation in the other channels as they are doing their more advanced planning this far out.
Absolutely. And, as you're thinking about getting all of this content, as you're getting your full strategy ready for end of year, you need to know that, it's not enough to have the perfect content strategy. You also have to be reaching the right people. So we can go to the next slide. That's why it's so critical to use the next few months to build up your list and onboard as many new supporters as possible, ensuring that they're primed and ready for those heavy fundraising asks that are going to be coming their way in December. So, a few different avenues that you should be using to be growing your list. Of course, you should be using paid advertising over Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to grow your list efficiently and cost effectively. You want to be utilizing that best performing content that you're seeing work on those other channels and make sure that you are scaling up during big moments. If there's a lot of media attention on your organization, or if there's a moment that your mission really speaks to, you should be scaling up, making sure that you are investing and bringing in as many supporters during that time as possible so they can all be on your list ahead of end of year. Then another really great way to grow your list is through fixed cost buys like Advantage AI, which is our first of its kind digital co-op. So with Advantage AI, we're combining the efficiency and predictability of fixed cost acquisition with that kind of predictive modeling that makes platforms like Facebook so powerful. So many of our members have seen full return on their investment in just 30 days and saw really, really great return, especially during end of year last year. what makes this really great is that, you can be getting your names in early, understanding how your Advantage AI names are going to do on your list. And once you've seen that strong response, you also, big benefit to fixed costs is that you can make more purchases, get more names really quickly, and get folks on even during end of year, in the middle of December, right ahead of Giving Tuesday. You can be adding even more names on your list and just making sure that you are, again, reaching the most folks as possible.
Yeah, I think even before we get to end of year, there's plenty that you should be doing in the lead up between now and really like November-ish, right? In addition to everything that Duncan just walked through for strategies that we might use to acquire as many names as possible, the best thing that you can and should be doing over the summer is testing. This is going to be your best and last big chance to learn as much as possible about your audience and the strategies that work before getting to that big push. This is super important because it's the exact type of opportunity that allows clients like Save the Children, for example, to increase their end of year revenue while decreasing their email volume. And that's by extensively testing before end of year, so that by the time you walk into the giving season, you already have your most optimized foot forward. Here at Ann Lewis Strategies, we like to structure all of our learning agendas, but especially our summer ones, around 3 testing tracks that I think will be useful to outline for you all here as you are thinking about and finalizing your summer plans, even before you get to end of year. First, we'll talk about strategic experiments, and then we'll walk through some pilots that we might recommend you try, and then we'll sort of differentiate those from the types of optimizations that we might see regularly in a program. So let's do some strategic experiments first. The way that we differentiate and talk about experiments here is the bigger strategic things that have big hypotheses associated with them. In our experiments, we start out with a hypothesis that is going to be replicable and usable at other times of the year. On the right-hand side here, we have some examples of what that might be. These are like your bigger questions about, does my list respond better to a standard all text or all copy email or an all graphic email? Do we see that emails that feature surveys generate more passive revenue than quizzes? Right? Things like that we might want to test into and try and corroborate over the course of the summer or any time of the year, so that we know which kind of tactic or strategy is going to work best for us during end of year. These to us are really the big juicy insights that we want to walk into our end of year giving season with. They might change from year to year, but they don't typically change too dramatically from season to season or across different audiences throughout the year. And there are a few other examples that we have for how these types of experiments might differentiate from, for example, pilots. So Duncan, do you want to talk about pilots for us?
Yeah, I definitely do. So, whenever you can, we always recommend testing out new tactics before fully implementing them. But sometimes even new strategy or tactic where there isn't really an avenue for that kind of direct testing that Orrin was just talking about. This is where you're going to want to pilot something to try it out. I think a really great example is, launching an SMS program. Can't exactly do testing to see if that will work for you. It's more something that you just want to try out. We're thinking that SMS is going to be especially powerful for this end of year because, even with the strongest content, even with the largest audience for your email program, breaking through in inboxes is only getting more and more difficult. I think if we can go to the next slide, we've got a great chart showing that, the number of emails deployed during end of year increased actually 28% between 2019 and 2020. And we're only expecting that to continue increasing in 2021. But a really great way to break through those inboxes is just to skip them entirely. SMS, you can reach your audience so directly. We've actually seen that 99% of SMSs are opened within 3 minutes. Another really great thing about SMS is that, you can scale it really quickly. Yes, we're only, about 6 months out from end of year, but that is plenty of time to get a program up and started. You can use peer-to-peer, which doesn't even require opt-ins, or broadcast, where, you can be asking folks to opt in right on your landing pages where you're acquiring those new folks on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere. What is also great about SMS is that, you can bring in a lot of those learnings from your other channels into a lot of the experimentation that Orrin was just talking about to figure out, what is the best content to be serving your audience. You want to be doing a lot of that experimentation, especially knowing that SMS does have limited character counts. Every word really, really matters. Not like an email where, you can go a little bit longer or a little bit shorter. You really just have about, usually aiming for about 306 characters to send. So you want to be doing some really extensive experimentation to understand what is going to make the biggest impact for your specific audience. And then another great pilot to try, one that I've already touched on a bit, is Advantage AI. So I already discussed how, it's a really great acquisition source to be piloting ahead of end of year. One of the organizations that we work with saw that the supporters that they were acquiring just ahead of end of year returned about 46% of their investment within 2 weeks. And what's great about getting this piloted ahead of end of year is that, you can do even more of that testing. You can really understand, what are these names specifically going to respond to? So by the time you get to end of year, by the time that you're doing, any future purchases, getting names in right before those big moments, you already know the content that is going to drive the absolute best results.
Yeah, as Duncan mentioned, with these pilots, the main point here is that these are things that are not typical tests. There isn't really like an A/B situation when you're trying Advantage AI or a new acquisition source, or you're opening a new channel like SMS. You're really just dipping your toe in the water to see how it's going to work. And to that end, Advantage AI, it is a really good idea to try something like that over the course of the summer. Potentially, it could take a little bit of some technical lift to make sure that everything is flowing exactly right. And so you want to hammer out all of those details both here, but in anything else that you're trying to do over the course of the summer before you get to the big final push during end of year, where you can really start to lean more into these different channels and tactics that are going to work or expand and be even more scalable during end of year.
Yeah, exactly. And then for even more immediate learnings than experiments and pilots, optimizations are great for improving your content in the moment. Orwin just described experiments as kind of big and juicy learnings. These are more just small tidbits, things that are going to help you more in the moment. Although, of course, optimizations can always lead to real learnings that can impact your entire program. So you really should constantly be optimizing, even during end of year. You're trying out new subject lines, graphic treatments, donation forms. Every piece of content across every channel can be optimized. One thing that we're also thinking about, things that you should be testing throughout this summer is during like rapid response moments, times when that you'll be reaching a large majority of your audience and are expecting that really high response. That's where you should be trying out that kind of new content, trying things like changing your buttons from donate to give now to understand what's going to work during future high response moments like end of year. So it's a really great time to just, try out those little tweaks that down the line can make a huge impact and can help you understand what is going to work best in those moments.
Yeah, I think it's important to rest here for a minute and just talk about optimizations a bit more broadly. The reason that we separate these out, and the reason that we're talking about these in a conversation around end of year planning, is because we don't typically assume that the types of, for example, subject lines or button copy, those types of things that work in the middle of August are necessarily going to be the things that stand out in crowded inboxes on December 29th or 31st, or whatever big moment and day you have during end of year. That's why these are more applicable in the moment that you're running them. It's important to know what's going to be more useful next week versus a few months from now, because of the nature that inboxes and the algorithms on social media and everything are changing at any given point in time. It is going to behoove you to stand out and be different from what other people are doing. And those things just move so quickly that it's important to have the more immediate testing, the optimizations at that time. So we can plan right now for a series of subject line tests on December 31st, but it's going to be much more difficult for us to test something, like I said, in August and say, cool, that's the type of subject line that's going to be most useful for us during end of year. Does that make sense to all of you? Do you have any questions about how we're thinking about optimizations versus pilots versus experiments, and how we're thinking about planning for those things for end of year?
Hey, this is Josh. I don't have any questions per se, but this is something that's certainly relevant to me and my program at Back of My Feet, just as a smaller digital program, that there isn't because of the size, there isn't as much opportunity to do testing and optimization, especially as we get closer to year end. And so that's something that we're already thinking about with some of the campaigns that we've run earlier, like the first half of this year, and to think about how we can, kind of leverage these kind of learnings towards later in the year. And certainly some of the other things that you've been talking about, the pilots we're certainly interested in and already kind of getting invested in the nearish future.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a common question, and I see there's another one in the chat about how smaller organizations and smaller lists can do this, because those smaller lists, you tend to have less data and less opportunity to do as much of that testing and to corroborate those results quite as much. So I would say in those instances, you want to aggregate your testing as much as possible in order to achieve that experimental sort of status. So that might be much more iterative. You might run the same test 3 times across the course of the summer. That way, by the end, you might have enough data to make a call one way or the other on something a bit more strategic, like should my email template look like X or Y? Should we have big graphics or small graphics, or however you want to do something like that? For optimization specifically, Annie, I think that this is going to depend on your email volume during end of year. Outside of end of year, outside of big moments, I think we would typically recommend an ABO style testing where you run a split test to say 25% or 50% of the list. 25% gets version A, 25% gets version B. The winner gets rolled out to the optimized segment. That becomes more and more challenging to do during high volume periods where you might have multiple emails sending on the same day, right? Where you might be cannibalizing yourself by saving part of that segment. So on Giving Tuesday, I'm not sure you want to do anything like ABO, but you can still do an AB test, say a subject line test the morning of Giving Tuesday, and say, cool, it seems like this type of subject line is working better right now than this other type of subject line. Maybe that's something that you feel comfortable with changing and modifying for other emails that you might be sending on Giving Tuesday. So to us, an optimization is something that can be easily changed on the day of, whether that's a subject line, or we can modify a button, or we can maybe swap out a graphic, right? When we're talking about those big experiments, it's much more difficult to make a new email template or design an entirely new email with a couple hours notice. So those are the types of questions that we want to ensure you're answering over the summer, so that when you're doing these optimizations, whether it's an ABO or just an AB test that you carry from one email to the next, those are things that you can quickly and rapidly spin up on the day of or on the fly. Does that answer your question, Annie?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Were there any other questions about optimizations and experiments and testing? And if there are, you can always follow up on email. I think you guys have all of our information now. We're always happy to chat through how your programs might be structured for the summer, or offer any advice on any of that. So let's go ahead and pull all of this together and really talk about phasing for our ideal end of year planning schedule. We're talking about this in June right now. I think most of the direct mail programs that we interact with are planning to really kick off and launch, or already sort of doing that. End of June, July is when a lot of those brainstorms are starting to happen. As we mentioned several times now, have your digital folks in the room, have them represented, make sure that those direct mail plans are at least thinking about how they might integrate with digital. But we don't expect you to have email by email, ad set by ad set plans in July and August. That's a little too far out sometimes for a digital program. But certainly by the end of September, I think you should have most of those finalized. You should have your segments figured out. You should know how many variations you want to be running for whatever channels you're operating on, and really aim to have those finalized and approved by September. Because by around mid-September to at the latest mid-November, you want to be building and crafting all of your all of the assets for your plans. So that's when you're going to be drafting your email content. You're going to be designing all of your ads. You're going to be doing all of that work. And you really want all of that to be locked in before end of year really kicks off. And to us, end of year runs from all of November and all of December. But really, I think it's maybe the middle of November when things really start to pick up pretty heavily in the lead up to Giving Tuesday at the end of November, beginning of December. So by the time we hit December, you're optimizing and it's ready, time to launch. We also have this bar in here that is most of the summer, but including, you can go up to October and part of November for that experimenting and piloting of different types of tests and things that you're trying to learn in order to inform end of year. There might be a bit of a gap there because, like I said in the previous example, if you are testing email templates, for example, you kind of want to know what email template you're going to be running before you get to the middle of November. So those bigger types of experiments you might want to have finalized September, October. Are there any questions about this timeline, or how this is obviously ideal? And if we could just have it run smoothly like this, that's perfect, but they never do. So these things get pushed and they get squished, and they're always a little bit hectic at times because that's the nature of end of year. So if you're not quite running with this, don't worry too much about it. This is aspirational for sure. But if you need help getting back on track with any of these things, just let us know, and we're happy to help and offer some advice. But any questions about this timeline and how we're thinking about end of year planning? Super, very chatty bunch today. We will have my favorite slide is up next, which is sort of like your sort of mental checklist of things that we often run into as we are planning end of year with our clients and in-house. So these are sort of the questions that you should be asking yourself right now. We want to make sure that they're on your radar because these are the things that usually trip us up and trip our partners up as well. Two of the biggest questions, right? You should be thinking about what your budget for end of year is and what your targets and projections are. So a lot of organizations, depending on when your fiscal year is, have already done budgets and projections, or if not, are in the midst of it. Sometimes it's a summer activity, but you're going to want to know before you do, or before you can answer any of these other questions, and before you can set all of your plans, what are your targets? What are your projections? And how much money do you have to spend during end of year? From those numbers, work yourself backwards and say, how many emails am I going to need in order to hit those targets? How many pieces of ad creative am I going to need to hit those targets? How much spend will I be able to allocate to each of those ad sets, et cetera? And then there's some longer lead things that we like people to answer. If you are going to be using premiums during end of year or any type of merch opportunities, that's something that you should figure out now, and you should be asking in June rather than August, because that inventory takes a while. This is something that I find really helpful for direct mail programs, right? They often are already thinking about or already have premiums set up. They already have ways to deliver premiums. So piggybacking on them or using those brainstorms to figure out what you want to do for premiums can be super useful. Video content can take a really long time for folks to build out. So if you do want or need fresh, big, creative video content for end of year, do you have your spec list? Do you have your terms of reference and your storyboards? Have you thought through what those ought to be, more than just, hey, I would love a video that is a direct to camera of someone asking something, right? The more specific you can be now, the better. And you can put that in front of the right people at your organization to make that happen. Figuring out if you have the resources and capabilities to build splash pages and light boxes. The difference here, if you're unfamiliar with these terms, splash pages being a whole homepage takeover. Usually it's a donation form that takes over the homepage during key moments like that final stretch of end of year. And light boxes, those pop-ups, the interstitial pop-ups that take you to a donation form or something like that. Sometimes those can take a little bit more development work if you haven't done them before. So making sure that you get ahead of that now is pretty important. I think that content tends to be a problem during end of year, or making sure that you have the best stories and content to fuel your campaign, including the impact and urgent stories, right? The stories of impact, the stories of urgency, the different things in your toolbox. If you're not already thinking about this, or if you don't already have content people, you should be asking them and pushing them now to shore up the types of things that are going to be useful for you during end of year as you're doing all of your fundraising. Same thing goes for photography. Oftentimes we rely on photography, or we are sort of forced to rely on photography that might be a little bit older than we would hope. And so making some of those asks now of the types of photography that are going to work best for your program. Maybe this is something that you experiment over the summer and figure out what photography works best, and then try to get to your creative folks towards the end of the summer to go out and get and find that photography. Some of our organizations work with celebrities or principals and like senior leaders. So if you want them to sign an email or to be included in a video or a piece of creative, getting that buy-in now can be really helpful, especially for celebrities, because sometimes those asks need to be made pretty far in advance. Same thing sort of here goes for your corporate partnerships. Any offline events, galas, those types of things, you should be talking to those teams now to ensure that you have the right overlap and integration with them. One of the bane of our existence for a lot of our clients is ensuring that we have match funds secure for end of year, and that can be a process that sometimes isn't finalized until December. So the more that you can be talking to often your major gift officers, but also corporate partners and other frontline fundraisers to figure out where your match funds are going to come from for this year, you should just start having those conversations now to make sure that you get what you need for end of year. And pretty much everyone should be trying to use match money during end of year. It's like one of the most proven and tried and true tactics that we have. But also, I think it is a lot of goodwill, I think, to include your major gift officers and other frontline fundraisers into your plans, in case they might want to use some of the content that your teams might be creating, or in case you have to like do some overlap with some of those high value prospects and donors that you might be chatting to throughout end of year. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of all of the things that you can and should be asking yourself now. And we're not trying to like scare anyone with like, oh, you haven't done all these things. The reason that we're talking about all of this now in June is to get this on your radar, and so that you know that you can and maybe should be asking some of these questions now in order to get ahead of your end of year planning. And with that, with all of that, Duncan, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add. But I think we're hoping that you guys might have some questions about anything that we've discussed today, or any other advice and guidance that we can offer for your end of year planning, or about Apple's updates, or anything not at all related to what we've talked about today, but anything that you guys might be interested in. So we will turn the floor over to the room if anyone has questions for us.
I have a question. We haven't really used SMS before, text to give, and I'm wondering, I guess, how often would you want to text people, because we also don't want to annoy them and be too invasive. So what's kind of the optimal cadence for text to give? How is it best used in a year-end campaign? And, what's best practice for, are we asking everybody to opt in to receive text messages, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the number one thing that I would say here is, know your audience. If you wouldn't email them 10 times on a given day, probably shouldn't text them 5 times on a given day. We do find that, SMS is a little bit more disruptive than an email. You are getting that push notification. That's why we see such high opens right away. So you probably do want to think of it as a lighter cadence than email. Also, part of it is, for a lot of the CRMs, they are charging per message sent. So a little bit different than email. You do want to weigh that with your budget, and think about what makes sense for your organization. But I think the most important thing is, think about your audience, think about the response rates over email. When do you get to a volume where you see response start to dip, and make sure that, the SMS and the email programs are working together and you're not overwhelming the audience. But also, like with email, if you see great response to one message, that's maybe a great time to slot in another on one of those busier days. So I'd say, let response drive your volume. I think your other question was about opt-in. So if you are doing broadcast SMS, you do need folks to opt in. That usually means that they're just giving you their cell phone number with a blurb underneath that describes that they are opting in. You link to your privacy policy. So if you are looking to do broadcast, you will need to collect those opt-ins. A way that we've seen work really, really well is by adding that as a field on your sign-up pages for the folks that you're acquiring via Facebook, Twitter, wherever, and also on your email list. So if you're sending your list surveys, pledges, petitions, anything like that, you can add cell phone as a capture to make sure that you are, getting those folks over on your SMS program as well. If you are looking to do peer-to-peer instead, that does not require an opt-in, so that can maybe be a little bit quicker to stand up.
Okay, thank you. So are you saying any form that people are filling out, we're asking for their phone number, but on a lot of those forms, we'll have a checkbox say, would you like to join our email list or something? Essentially, do we need something like that? I imagine we need something like that for phone numbers as well.
Yeah,
we can't just assume because they gave us their phone number, they want to receive text messages.
Yeah, that's correct. So usually there's some very specific legal language that you put underneath to have folks opt in, and then usually also requires adding a link to your privacy policy there.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I had a question about mitigating what's going on with Apple. So like with other kind of email deliverability challenges or anything like that, it takes work, but not altogether difficult to like isolate email addresses from a specific domain. Like if you're trying to isolate a problem with Gmail, you can sluice off those people and then deal with them as you see fit or not. I'm just curious if you've thought through any ways to try and isolate. I mean, this is going to vary from platform to platform too. Try and isolate those people who you can or try to identify as an iOS user, or at least like an Apple user, so that you can try to measure those people's those people's engagements separately from those that use really any other mail client.
That's a great question. I mean, that's a hard question, Josh. Always asking the tough ones. And that's not where I thought that question was leading. I don't have an answer for that right now, to be honest, where we can try to identify what email client people are using. There might be services out there that can help us predict that. But I can't really think of any that are super reliable right now. Now, the first part of your question, which is how can we isolate and look at users based on deliverability by domain, that's a little more doable still here. Because while open rates are going to be much less useful to us in the future because of the high market share that Apple clients have, 40 to 50%, 60%, something like that, of people use either Apple Mail or the desktop Apple Mail client. Because of that, open rates are going to be much less useful, but they're not 0% useful, right? So on the one hand, we still might be able to discern differences in open rates, assuming like if you're running like an A/B test, for example. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this all the time because it's going to be so volatile for us to look at. And if you have a large enough email list though, like you can imagine that a randomly selected group for an A/B test would have roughly the same amount or same number of folks in either group that are randomly selected and using Apple clients. So if you have enough data, you still might be able to get statistically relevant differences there. And so something similar could happen with your email domains, right? If your new open rates are suddenly like 50%, right? If our open rates all jump to 50% or something because all of these opens are being registered by Apple clients. And one group, one domain drops down to 30%. Previously we might say if something goes to 0 or something goes to 5% or something really low, we might say that's a problem with this domain. And so we still might be able to determine a little bit based on relative open rates compared to the broader list. There's also a bit of like data science-y type of work. I don't want to scare anyone with like data science-y type of work, but like on your own, you might be able to figure out if someone has like 100% open rate after this happens, right? Then you might assume that they're an Apple client, right? You can say, hey, look, this one user has opened every single email for the past month by the time we get to October. It's not going to be perfect, but you might be able to say, okay, we have a strong inclination that might be someone who is using an Apple client because all of their opens are being registered compared to other folks. That might take a little bit more than a month for us to figure out, right? It might take more frequent mailing for that. And if you guys can't quite figure that out, there might be a way that our data science team can answer those questions for you, like who would theoretically have a 100% open rate or a near 100% open rate. So there's some nuances there, and it's not going to be perfect, but those are the ways that I would most immediately think about figuring out.
Yeah, it was that very last example that's where I was headed, as to if all of a sudden you're able to isolate these percentage of people who all of a sudden are opening every email, then you know some things about them. One, that you can probably likely assume that they are an Apple Mail user, either on a mobile or desktop. But also I was thinking of it as the next step is this isn't going to happen until September with Apple, right? If there's time in September still to do that, maybe there isn't, to do that and then remove those people from any testing that you're going to do, so that you can test on the people that you think that are non-Apple people. If you want to, if you're trying to do any test regarding subject line or things that an open would impact, the closer you can get to a non-like muddied audience, the better. Maybe that's not possible right now, given that this isn't going to happen until September, but that's where I was headed in how can we figure out who these people are, and then how can we kind of move them off to the side in order to do some other things where we do want open rate to be like an effective KPI.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that there's the thing that to keep in mind is there are some people that are some subscribers that you guys have, everyone has, that are like super fans and that open every email, and they might not do it on Apple, right? So you just have to always remember that you could be capturing your super users as well into those groups. And I think one of the nice things about this change is that it can and should force us to focus on other types of metrics for optimizations. So even previously, we wouldn't typically do a ton of optimizing based on open rates, because we do care more deeply about the higher level engagement. And I think this is the same. You can still look at a subject line test, an A/B test for subject lines, and say, version A led to a greater donation rate or greater response rate. That's the subject line we should use. And the difficult thing there is that you get fewer donations, which means less data, which means you are going to have even fewer statistically significant tests that you are running based on subject line in that case. So in our default, we might run down that list and say, cool, it's not statistically relevant on donation rate, not statistically relevant on click rate or click to open rate, but it is statistically relevant on open rate. That last step is the thing that we just might not be able to discern anything with anymore. But we'll be structuring most of our optimizations for our clients based on response rate and click rate and after September. We still already do, but even more so after September. It's a great question. Are there any other questions about Apple or about end of year planning or anything unrelated? I don't know. Or phrased another way, is there anything that you all thought we might have covered today, but then didn't cover?
One thing I thought about is kind of what are the predictions about trends for giving for year end 2021. now that we've been through or coming through a pandemic and economic difficulties, and our people, I think there was a lot of crisis giving last year, but is that trend going to continue, or are we expecting, how do we adapt our plans for what's happening around us?
That's a tough question as well, Annie. I wish that I could predict the future, and I wish I had a crystal ball. And the easy answer is for us to say we don't know, right? But I can offer some speculation and some hypotheses about what we might be thinking about. So grab all of the grains of salt that you have near you for what we're going to talk about, because I think after some of us have been doing this for more than a decade, and I think like the thing that always surprises us is with these big moments, they tend not to do what we expect them to. So in previous economic recessions, in previous massive political elections, after giant fundraising initiatives that stem from natural disasters and large international emergencies and things like that, our expectation and worry tends to be, oh, people have given a lot, people are really tired, and they're not going to do it again. Or we're going to see a dip. And certainly there are some organizations at various points in time that you do see those dips. But I never really count out the generosity of American donors. And I suspect that the fatigue that we might see and expect right now is partially related to a year of trauma and the pandemic, and a year of exceptional generosity because of the pandemic, but also because of the 2020 election. And so I know that a lot of folks in the industry have been experiencing some softer than expected fundraising so far in 2021 and this spring. And I would really expect that to continue through the summer for a lot of organizations, as I don't know about all of you, but like I'm excited to get to the beach. And I assume that a lot of folks are excited to not really be thinking about a pandemic or a presidential election or anything like that. So I would expect that kind of fundraising to perhaps be a little more challenging for some organizations over the summer. But when it comes down to it, during end of year, I am not necessarily expecting or anticipating a massive decline year over year. I'm going to be really, really not pleased if that turns out to be the case. But I think we have seen this enough times in the past to know that that the people show up if we have the right strategies and tactics in testing beforehand. And if we can make our content and creative as compelling as possible, as timely, as urgent, all of the other best practices that you guys have been doing for so long, it might be a little tougher than usual, but it's certainly not going to be impossible. And I'm sort of predicting that a number of nonprofits are going to have really fantastic ends of year. I don't know if that answers fully, and that is my personal speculation about what is going to happen. But again, that's barring another insert whatever terrible thing that could happen, or monkey wrench that is thrown into our plans. I'm actually super curious if Maureen or Alex have any thoughts about this in broader industry terms, what fundraising might do.
I agree with everything that you just said, Orwin. It's a lot of unknowns, and I'm hopeful that everything works out. I think what we saw last year and the year before was more of a diversification of when people are giving. And I think that this year will be more of a dependency on end of year, which makes the planning and the days such as Giving Tuesday, December 31st, that sort of thing, all the more important. But I think the next few months will really show us the overall trends, and we'll be able to kind of take that and really add it to some projections to outline what we think might happen. But to your point, I think all of us are excited for a bit of a summer that's different from last year, at least. And so I would assume that we'll see more of a hockey stick, if you will, this year than last year.
Super. We probably have time for one more question if anyone has anything. Otherwise, we can, I'm sure you all have busy schedules and lots of meetings. Great. In that case, thank you all very, very much for joining us. I think you should have our email information. If there's any questions that you guys have, you can email us at nonprofit@annlewisllc.com, or you might have our other email addresses. So just let us know if you have any additional questions. Thank you all very, very much for joining us. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, folks.